Good afternoon and welcome to the Debut Spotlight. I'm your host for the day, Ellen Comisar, and I'm delighted to welcome Simone Gorrindo, who is the author of a highly acclaimed brand new memoir called The Wives. I'm going to talk about that for most of the hour, but first let me just introduce people to the Blaze. For those of you who are frequent flyers here, welcome back. We're delighted to have you again. For those of you who are new, welcome. By way of introduction, we are a team of 30 or so creative professionals, all dedicated to connecting readers and writers in the age of COVID and beyond. If you like what you see here, please follow us all over social media. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, of course, where this interview will live in perpetuity. We also have a newsletter that comes out every Sunday that tells you what shows are upcoming. And so that way you won't miss anything brand new and exciting. You can find that at www.amightyblaze.com. So today I am delighted to welcome Simone Gorrindo, who has written The Wives, which came out this past Tuesday, just yesterday, and has already seen lots of great press. Simone was on Good Morning America yesterday and in the New York Times this past weekend, among other places. Her book, according to the New York Times, has fluid and inviting prose, and her storytelling is intimate and vivid. It's an engaging, evocative memoir. Publishers Weekly gave Simone a starred review for her powerfully candid debut. Quote, "It's a haunting, beautifully written celebration of found sisterhood." Kirkus called it an intimate memoir of sacrifice and devotion. Library Journal said it was a fearless, engaging, and important memoir about how one person's decision to serve in the military affects their entire family. And Katie Gutierrez, who has been a guest on the Debut Spotlight for her memoir, More Than You'll Ever Know, praises Simone, saying she explores the loyalty and ferocity of female friendship under the most pressurized conditions. And she's a dazzling talent. How about that? I got all choked up on your praise. So welcome, Simone.
Thank you, Ellen. It's so wonderful to be here. It's such an honor.
Well, we're excited to have you. Let me just introduce our readers to you a little further, our viewers. Simone Gorrindo's writing has appeared in the New York Times, New York Magazine, Long Reads, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Christian Science Monitor, the Best of Women's Travel Writing, Self, and other publications. Simone has a Master's of Science in Journalism from Columbia and has received fellowships and grants for her writing and reporting from the International Women's Media Foundation, the Georgia Council for the Arts, and the Hambidge Center for Creative Arts and Scientists. She lives in Tacoma, Washington, with her husband and 2 children. The Wives, of course, is a debut, and it's also a Book of the Month Club audio selection this month with Simone herself as the narrator. So welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you for that lovely introduction.
Thank you. So can you just give us I think the praise did some of it, but can you just give us a nutshell version of what your memoir is primarily about?
Yeah, of course. So it's really about a time when my husband decided to join the Army, which he's still in. And I transitioned from a life as an editor in New York City to an Army wife in Columbus, Georgia, where I really felt immediately like a stranger in a strange land. But that was fertile ground for becoming part of a really incredible, tough, complicated group of women who became my close friends. And it's very much about learning the value and importance of relationships to get us through the times in our lives that feel impossible. And also, I learned during my time there, and it's something that I hope comes through in the memoir, that despite our many differences, we have a shared humanity. And that was something I learned in my time there.
You speak a bit in the book about your transition from New York to Georgia. Can you talk about the culture shock you had there?
Can I talk about it? Is that what you said?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure you can.
Yes, I certainly can. Yeah, when I arrived in Georgia, the furthest south I'd ever been was, I think, Northern Virginia at that point in my life. And I had been in New York City since I was 17, with an exception of a short departure for a couple of years. And so I was used to, on a really like bodily, visceral level, walking out my door and just being assaulted by humanity. That you get used to that living in New York City.
Yes, you do.
And I think moving anywhere after being in New York during your formative years feels very quiet. Columbus is not rural. Columbus, Georgia, it's a 200,000 person town. There's a university, but it felt so quiet to me. And I remember that was one of the hardest parts because my husband left for Afghanistan 2 weeks after we arrived.
Wow.
And I knew only the woman across the street who becomes, a very important person in my life and a character in the memoir. And I would just sit on my couch and wait for people to pass the window. And so, it really kind of highlighted how alone I was. And then also, I think there were things I took for granted in New York that I lost really abruptly. And I think that happens with anyone who makes a huge transition. But being a writer, especially, and an editor, I had this community of other writers and colleagues. And it was so much the air I breathed that I hadn't understood what a huge transition it would be to lose not just those people, but that identity. And so I think in a weird way, the shock, yes, it was shocking to go down to the grocery store and see an old man with a pistol on his hip, picking up a box of dried mashed potatoes or that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. That was shocking at first. It became more normal. But I think in many ways, the biggest shock to my system was the identity transition and the upending of my identity. And, coming from a place like New York where the question is always, what do you do? Or at least the community I'd ended up in at that point in New York, which you're asked that so much so. I remember being like, can anyone ask anything else? We are not just our jobs. But then I got to Georgia and it was really, where are your kids? When are you having kids? I was 28 and it was unusual not to have any children in the community I was in. And so I felt really other in a way that I didn't in New York. And that was a real different set of cultural norms that I think cultural norms are so integral to our identities and even the choices we make in our lives that I really had to think about who I was. I had to rethink it all, when I got to Georgia and over the next 4.5 years.
That's, I think, a brilliant segue to a passage that I really want you to read. Simone and I talked about this before in our little green room. I'll just give it a little setup. Simone and her husband, Andrew, are at a gala, which she sort of likens to senior prom, that all these women are worrying about their dresses months ahead of time and what are they going to wear and what you haven't gotten a dress. And as part of this evening, various men in the unit and on the base concoct what sounds like a vile drink of various liquors as well as sand.
Yeah, don't forget the sand.
Don't forget the sand. And they make this terrible drink and they're all proudly taking a sip, and Simone is encouraged by Andrew's friend Jack and others to try this lovely concoction. And I want Simone, if she will, to read this one section and then we can talk about it.
Thank you. That was a great setup. Okay. Jack put his arm around me. You're an amazing wife, he said, and the fire in my chest spread through my arms and legs. I felt like I had won a prize, an amazing wife. These days, wife was my entire identity. At times, the title sounded like a nag to me. It's your wife on the phone, Sergeant, Andrew's private would call to him when I called him at work, and I'd feel myself cringe. I chafed so fiercely against the title's constraints that I'd even written an essay at one point about my frustration called The Writer and the Army Wife. No one here knew me as a writer. Everyone knew me as a wife. Wife could be worn as a badge of honor or thrown around as casually and affectionately as a phrase like, you guys. It'll just be the wives. Just could be used differently, though, said with a twist of a knife. She's just a wife, I'd heard guys say, which meant she didn't wear a combat infantry badge or a ranger tab. She hadn't done anything deserving recognition. This felt different from any of those, though. This was confirmation, acceptance. I had drunk the Kool-Aid, and now I was in, stamped, sealed, and approved by a soldier. It was a reward I hadn't even known I'd sought. I wondered, though, if it came at the expense of my friendship with Haley in some quiet way. She still wasn't looking at me in the eye. So I went a little over there.
That's all right. That's all right.
Got in the flow.
And for those of you viewers, you can see why Simone was the perfect choice to narrate her own memoir. I could just see that scene and calling into your husband's unit. So this transition from being a New York editor, writer, living the life of a career woman to being now in a house near base with the wives, as you were affectionately teamed. You became this sorority, this sisterhood. And I'm wondering, you initially start with this friendship with Rachel. Did your understanding of friendships change, your appreciation of them when you got to Georgia?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's funny. It's when I first got there, I remember, and it's in the book, Andrew said to me, my husband said to me when he was leaving, we got there when he was leaving in 2 weeks to go to Afghanistan. He said, you should be friends with Rachel, because I'd met her immediately and we'd gone to drop off for the deployment together and seen each other cry before we really knew anything about each other. And I said, yeah, maybe, but I don't know. What do we have in common other than, what our husbands do? And I felt like such an unlikely Army wife. I'd been from this really pretty pacifistic background. If there was an anti-war march, I'd been there, as a teenager and in my 20s. And so I thought we're not going to have anything in common, right? That's kind of what I expected. And I think in many ways I was kind of provincial and not a very open person, because I'd had a really isolated experience in terms of just like geographically in the country. I'd grown up in California. I'd moved to New York at 17, and I really hadn't seen the rest of the country. So as time went on, though, it's funny, I didn't, Rachel and I did have things in common, fortunately, but I also found that common ground, well, first of all, we had it in a daily way. When if my husband was leaving, her husband was leaving, and true of the other women as well. And so we did have immediate common ground in that sense. And then beyond that, though, I really do feel like there was a shifting of priorities for me, where I started to value if somebody showed up or not.
Right.
And I don't think I hadn't valued that before, but that became number one, and everything else became secondary to friendship. And what I mean by that is, when our husbands left, we were more than friends in a lot of ways. We acted as partners to each other. I went to OB appointments with Rachel. I watched my friend Haley's kids. We showed up at emergency rooms for each other after car accidents. We called each other after we got messages from overseas about somebody being injured or killed. And so we lived really mundane daily realities and very kind of, the harder, more terrifying ones as well together. And I think because so much of life was just about kind of getting through a lot of the time, it really mattered if somebody showed up at your door with dinner or to have dinner or picked up the phone when you called them. And I think that shifting of priorities has not left me. And I have become more of that kind of person. I mean, that is like, if anything, as a friend, I want to be that person who shows up, both in times of need and in times of celebration. So I would say, yeah, that's been a huge shift for me.
Whereas I know from living in New York, one of the last things you wanted was somebody just showing up at your apartment. Right?
That is true.
Meet at the corner. Great.
Yes.
Goodbye.
So funny and so true. Yeah. And I mean, I missed my friends in New York. And I still miss a lot about New York City. And I love that I get to be here right now. It's an absolute dream come true. And at the same time, there was, something I hear people say a lot. I mean, there's even been books, I think, written about this now, is that it becomes harder and harder to make friends in your, early 30s and your 40s. And really, once you're swept up in family life and jobs and it just takes over, it's hard to even find pockets of time for old friends, and even harder to find pockets of time for new friends, because it takes time to build intimacy. And I think what I really got in those years in Georgia that was really unusual for somebody in their, heading into their early 30s, was intimate time with female friends. And it was like, I mean, there were times it really felt like college, where we would just, I mean, late in the book, I was basically living at Rachel's house. I mean, we were roommates, and I was helping her take care of her toddler. And I mean, that is such, looking back at the time, my husband was deployed. I had a horrible anxiety. It was a rough year in so many ways. And at the same time, like, what a gift. I will never, I don't think I'll ever get to have an experience like that again. So it's, it's a rare gift that I got. That it's time, really, that I got, that I wouldn't have had in New York, because everyone is so freaking busy here.
Absolutely. I remember it well. The good news about living somewhere else is you can always go back to New York, and that energy will still be there.
It's true.
I can vouch for that myself. If you're just joining us, I am talking to Simone. Oops, I said I'd do it right. Simone Gorrindo, author of the brand new memoir, The Wives, which is out this week from an imprint of Simon & Schuster. I want to talk about this intimacy of the friendships, of your time with the women who share this sense and this experience of sending their husbands out to fight. At the same time, your marriage had sort of a divide because of this. Andrew's decision to enlist came as a bit of a surprise to you. You were not yet married. He made it very clear, this is what I'm doing. Are you coming along for the ride or not? And that created some strain, the physical distance, as well as just his admiration and passion for what he was embarking upon. Can you talk about how that was a challenging aspect to you and or to the friends you were living amongst?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It was a shock to me at first, right after we moved in together in our early mid-20s. He said, seemingly out of nowhere, sometimes I think about joining the military. And I said, I would leave you. And it was like, I did not mince words. It just came out of my mouth, because I not only had I grown up in a pretty anti-war household and a very left-wing kind of bubble of Marin County outside of San Francisco, I also just, kind of the image of the Army wife to me was a woman who was waiting at home for her husband to come home and following her spouse wherever he was sent, and really just kind of losing agency in your life. Right. Like I think I responded that way because it just I was afraid of the idea of just giving my life over to something like the Army. But he didn't say anything about it for 2 more years. So I guess I really freaked him out. And then it came back up and it wasn't letting go. And it really was when he told me we were engaged and went to couples therapy because it was such a sticking point. Which is actually great. I think probably every engaged couple should go to couples therapy. It was productive. But he said, if it's between you and the Army, like if I have to make this choice, I'm going to choose the Army. And that was also a shock to me because he had been this enduring, reliable partner and source of love. And he had always been so sure about us from the very get-go. I mean, on our first date, he said, I'm going to marry you after he had a couple too many drinks. And I think that, I mean, to hear him say that was hard, but it also gave me a sense of, wow, like the conviction of how much he needed to do this. And that was not something I wanted to take away from him. So yeah, I mean, the issue there, right, though, is that he is enduring and reliable and there when I need him. And yet he's not there when I need him. I mean, that's kind of the reality. And it's sort of hard to reconcile at times because there have been many hard times, both as a person in my life and as a mother, that I haven't had him there. And it has been, I've had to do many, many hard things and many joyful, beautiful things alone. And our kids have had to do many hard and joyful things without him there as well. So it's, friend, to answer your question about friends responding different, how they responded. I mean, it was all over the map, to be honest. And I think it was hard for people. Mostly it just was hard for people to understand because my friends in New York, just like me, really didn't have any experience of the military. And I do think there's this feeling of, you go away to the military and it's sort of like you're being stolen away. And I think people probably felt that way about me, family and friends, and even more so Andrew's family and friends felt that way about him. And I felt that way about him because that is true. There's a kind of, the military does care about its families, but duty to the unit, always comes first. And that creates a push and pull, between me and Andrew, and also inside of himself. I think he has felt tugged in different directions in equal measure for the last 12 years. And I've become more and more understanding and aware of how hard that is to live with, like what a challenge that is, and how much love and energy and work he puts in to living with such a kind of, I don't know, incompatible allegiance.
Having to compartmentalize is the two things he cherishes: his belonging to the Army and his belonging to you and the family.
Exactly. And I think that was probably easier for him in the beginning. And it gets harder, it gets harder once you have kids and they get older, because there are things I can understand. There are things I can rationalize. There are ways I can compartmentalize that our children can't.
Right. And I think you talk beautifully about sort of the issues of both, I'll use these words, I'm not sure that the right ones, abandonment when he leaves and worry and fear, and then sort of the hard landing when he comes back, having been overseas, fighting, experiencing many things that you will never experience, nor have you chosen to experience. And just sort of that divide between, there's a commonality of your lives, and then there's these two very separate parts, like that Venn diagram has a lot that's outside the overlap from each of you.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think marriage is so strange because even when your spouse, even when you're together every night, I think you're experiencing, the same, you have built this life together, but you're having kind of parallel experiences. You're not having the same experience because you're different people. And so I think that is always kind of like what's rich and beautiful and also hard about marriage, because there's this feeling sometimes of like, can you see me? Can you hear me? Because I don't know if you're understanding my version of this experience, because it's can't be the same. So it's sort of like that times 100 because, he's overseas and I'm at home taking care of kids. And those are really different versions, like different sides of the coin of the experience of deployment, I guess you could say. And it's hard because I'm not asked to understand what he's going through. In the sense that while he's gone, it's mostly kind of, he can't tell me what's happening and I shouldn't ask. That's an expectation of the unit. And so, and at the same time, he's trying to live with the family and be over there. And I think that what happens, he has learned how to go back and forth. And he's gotten better at that, but it was very hard in the beginning, especially because, there's a memo that we got early on in the book that I write about, where essentially they're telling us we're not, I'm pausing here because it looks like we got disconnected, baby. Are you still there, Ellen? Are you back?
I'm back.
Did you disconnect there? Okay.
I don't know what happened.
But what I was going to say was that memo earlier in the book, about kind of what to expect when he gets home.
Right.
Which is that, like, he's going to smell bad. He's going to be cussing constantly. He's going to forget all of the tasks of home life because his mission set has been so narrow. And it's, basically the message is kind of what makes for a good soldier doesn't make for a good spouse. And that's true. And that's like 100% true, except that they're highly competent and they're great in emergency, right? But everything else, it's like all the kind of flexibility and tenderness and compromise that need to be there in family life have been kind of, exiled. Like he's kind of put them in a box, put it on a shelf and went and done his job. And he has to come back and retrieve those. And that we're not given guidebooks on how to do that. And I'm not given a guidebook on how to kind of, access all the things that I haven't. It's like, I'm not going to be allowed to know, operational security stuff, but kind of how do we share with each other after being in these like so apart and not being able to speak freely in the ways that we wanted to. So it's taken a lot of time. And really this book is in part about those first fumbling years when we were both pretty terrible at it and didn't know what we were doing.
And as such, I mean, I'm going to make an endorsement right now. I think the U.S. Army should give this to every new military wife.
I love it. This will be the guidebook.
They should.
I don't know. They might. Yeah.
Because
we'll see.
For somebody who's not been raised in a military family, I mean, lots of Army wives have brothers and fathers who have served and have at least some sense of what Army life is like. But for everybody else, myself included, this was eye-opening. It was educational. It gave me great empathy for the situation you went through. One of the other scenes that was really powerful and that sort of explained or exemplified how you and Andrew were coming at this from different places is when he said he wanted to have a gun in the house and that you should know how to shoot one. And he took you to the gun range.
Oh gosh.
Can you just talk in brief about that and both how you felt then about guns, how you feel now, having kids in the house,
Yeah, it's a good question. And it has changed since I've had kids, our relationship with guns, I think to some extent has changed. But yeah, when I got there, that was probably the biggest culture shock because I had lived in places where gun regulation was so strict and culturally guns were not, especially in the Bay Area, it was not cool to have a gun. So I got to Georgia and not only were there guns? I mean, there were guns in drawers in the kitchen. There were guns on top of the fridge. There were guns on people's hips at the liquor store.
At the
And
parties you went to.
sorry,
At the
at parties
parties
we
you
went
went to
to,
with
and
lots of
I
alcohol.
didn't have kids at the time, and I can't imagine how I mean, I would have left in some of those instances. I would have just said, I can't be here. But the time I still was really uncomfortable. And also a lot of people lived out of city limits. So we'd be hanging out in a barbecue and they'd start shooting guns in the backyard. And that was like a total shock to me, but super common, actually, at many gatherings we went to. And so I kind of got Andrew's argument when he brought it up. I think it was about a year into living there that he said, I want to have a gun. Everyone else here has guns. It's kind of how it felt. And I do this for a living and I need to be able to practice shooting different kinds of guns. And I understood that, but I really didn't want one in my home. And eventually I capitulated. I mean, it's kind of like the Army, right? It's sort of like you accept it without necessarily resolving my many ambivalent feelings about it. Mm-hmm. And I agreed with him. I needed to learn how to use one. And that was the first week I was there, I was like, I need to know how to shoot a gun. Like, this is super dangerous to be in a place like this and not know how to use one. So I was game to go to the range. But I did not do well. Not only was I a horrifically bad shooter, I was so uncomfortable with like the physical noise, the power, the kickback of the power of the handgun, just the sulfurous smell of the bullets, just all these things. And really, honestly, guns are complicated machines. They're all very different from one another. They have fascinating histories. And I know very little and yet so much more than I used to about guns. I think guns also are they're not just a thing. They carry so much baggage. Absolutely. And so much like cultural history, as they should, that it's hard to separate those two things. And so I think perhaps some of my response to going to the range, which I did, end up going a few times, was all of that stuff was wrapped up in it. All of that, like seeing, watching the news when Columbine happened, or watching the news, which I talk about in the book, when Sandy Hook, the news of that came on TV. It's like, how do you separate those things?
Right.
And I still don't know how. And now that we have children, there are no loaded guns anywhere in the house. They're pretty much in the basement. And not everyone would agree with that decision. But that's been the decision we've made. And it's, yeah.
It's understandable. All right. I want to shift gears a little bit, because while in many ways that you talk about in The Wives, you did lose your identity, but your identity as a writer is not lost. You're doing a lot of writing now, obviously, with your book. Can you talk about how important it was when you got offered the opportunity to go to the Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, on a fellowship to do some reporting? And also, linked to that, it would be great if we could discuss a little bit sort of the difference between writing about somebody else, as a reporter does, as an editor is expected to look for and copy, and writing about yourself and your own friends and family, as it were.
Yeah, it's a great question that I think I can answer. I might get to the Congo aspect of it, but
okay. Start where you want.
But I have a way of answering that might be, we'll see. So anyhow, I went to graduate school for journalism at Columbia. And it was when I was there that Andrew got really serious about joining, or started really seriously thinking about it. And so once it was clear to me that this was not something he was giving up on, I wanted to understand everything I could about the military, because that's just the way I process new experiences. So I not only read a lot of books, I started reporting on active duty and veterans affairs. And I ended up doing my master's thesis on a group of women veterans. Wow. And and originally I was trying to find men in the kind of combat unit my husband was in, but they did not want to talk to me, which which I'm now not surprised by, but they were not interested in talking to me. And so, what I did find was women vets who were really combat vets, but not given that designation, but because the nature of the battlefield now, they had really been in combat, wanted to talk to me, because I think a lot of them felt really invisible, and a lot of them were treated that way in terms of having a very hard time getting VA benefits for physical injuries and PTSD. And so it's interesting. I learned a ton about the Army during that time, and yet none of it prepared me, like not even a little bit. And I read memoirs by Army spouses. Just barely prepared me for the experience of actually marrying Andrew and moving to Georgia and going through these successive deployments. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think one thing that is hard for people outside of the world of the military to really grasp is that it's not a monolith. It's a country unto itself, made up of, it's an ecosystem that's very complex. Right. And my experience is radically different than, say, a Navy officer's wife living in Rhode Island. It's not the same, not even close. So I think I could learn just as much about her experience reading a book that she wrote as she could about mine.
Have you read Kristen Hanna's book, The Women?
I just got it, and I
haven't yet, but I'm
excited to read it. I'm so excited to read it, because I know nothing about the Vietnam nurses, and it did make me think. Her talking about it made me think quite a bit about those women veterans, and I think they still feel quite invisible. And I hope there's been some good writing on it. I hope there's more. But I think that what I found when I got to Georgia was I had kind of the journalist's eye when I arrived. I thought, well, I love new experiences. I'm going to take this in. I'm going to take notes. But I came to a point where it was my life, and I couldn't write about it like a journalist. I had too much at stake. And I was changing, like the experience of being there and the experience of being married to this unit really was such a fundamental shift for me that I kind of left. I didn't leave reporting behind entirely, but I became much more interested in doing personal writing, because it was kind of the only way I could kind of put the pieces together and, shift through the pieces and put them together into something I could understand.
Did you plan to write a memoir, or when did that become apparent that you were ready to write a memoir?
Yeah, it's a good question. I wrote a lot of essays during my time in Georgia, and I thought about writing a memoir, but I did not think I was going to write about this experience, because I'd been doing personal writing for a while, and I really found, once I found personal writing, that it just really lit me up, and I loved it. I love personal essay writing. But I didn't think, one, it's a complicated thing to write. There's a reason there are not a lot of books like this, and one of them is that our role is really to be silent. We are told again and again, don't post this on social media. Don't tell anybody where your husband's going. Don't tell him where he's going to be home. So there's a real, it's a protected world. And I respect that and understand why that is. And that was of utmost concern to me to navigate that sensitively as I wrote the book. But it made writing the book hard. It was definitely a challenge. And so I wasn't sure I was ready to take on such a challenge. And then, I think it really started to come together when I wrote a piece that was published in the New York Times. I had my first baby, and I'd moved to Washington State, and I really realized how much I missed these women who had been kind of my whole world in Georgia. And I suddenly was alone with a baby, and they were all mothers. And I was like, oh my gosh, all of the people who've taught me everything I know about parenthood I suddenly have lost them all. And I started to write about them, I think just purely because I missed them. And that piece that I published in the Times, I just heard from so many people who read it kind of as a tribute, which I did mean it as one, because they're just the toughest women I've ever met. And they're all radically different from one another, but they are all tough. And also it made me realize that people didn't have any sense of this experience. Like, it's gotten such little airtime. And as I wrote more and more, I just kind of realized this is not just my experience or this group of women's experience. This is a collective experience that is centuries old, that very few people have given much thought to because it's not brought into the light very often. So I think as that really like hit home for me, it became more and more important for me to write this. And I also just couldn't stop writing it. So it just happened.
If you want to see
As books happen. What was that?
If you want to see some of Simone's writing, you can check out her own website, SimoneGorrindo.com. And you'll want to do that after you've purchased this book, The Wives, which you can get at bookshop.org or at any indie bookstore. We really encourage you to buy from the indies. They need our support, and they do great work on behalf of writers. And so we like to encourage our readers to do the work and go take that extra minute and drive down to an indie bookstore or find them online. Do we have any questions for Simone? Kim Rutter, what made you want to write this book? Was it to help deal with everything for yourself or to help other new military wives?
I did not think about new military wives. I definitely thought about the military wives I know as I wrote, and it kind of felt like they were in the room with me every time I sat down to write, because I was mindful of writing something that felt collectively true, not just true for me, but for everybody, and also that honored their and our experience in a way that was generous, but also true and authentic. And so I definitely thought about them quite a bit. And I also think it wasn't conscious, but I do think the writing of the book helped me reconcile those things I was talking about earlier in terms of like the incompatibility of my husband being both the person I can rely on and not rely on at the same time. And these just sort of these like unanswerable questions, both about loving someone you can't always understand and about, when is war ethical or is it ever ethical? Right. Quandaries that I can't solve, I have to write about. And so those two things are really at the heart of the book. In addition to it really being about this community of radically different people, building friendships. And
have you heard from any of them? Has there been any
criticism
or praise?
Few of them have read it. The main characters have read it, and they've been really supportive. And they said, you really painted this crazy life with accuracy. Like, you certainly got that right for sure. And several of them are reading it who are in the book are reading it now. And it's interesting, it's going to be, I think I'll get an array of responses from just military spouses in general, because I think, like I said earlier, like some people will say, this doesn't depict my life. This doesn't reflect my experience, because it's, I hope that there are universal things at the core of the story. And I think there are. I think anybody who's ever felt like a stranger in a strange land or longed for home or had a child or gotten married will relate. Absolutely. And at the same time, I think people sort of cling to their personal experience as like definitional. So, I think some spouses might feel like, well, this is not how it is to be a military wife. I mean, but it's even the difference between being an enlisted wife, which is what I am, versus an officer's wife. It's like somebody wrote a comment on a piece I wrote in the Times that was something like that. The gulf between them is as vast as the sea. It is vast. And I think that's something that the general readership doesn't understand. And that became really important to me in writing the book, because every memoir I could find about this kind of experience was by an officer's wife. And officers, just to give some context, it's kind of the more like political white collar job, and enlisted men are, doing a lot of the dirty work. I don't know. I can't think of the right phrases, but and I think that's not an experience that's been written about hardly at all. And it was important for me to see that out there.
Did you have to go through a sensitivity read with the military in any
No.
sense? Did they put any restrictions on you, or did you seek their counsel in any way?
Ooh, no, I did not seek the military's counsel. I certainly sought my husband's counsel. He read
Okay.
4 drafts of it, and he was able to bring, I think, real nuance and sensitivity to certain things I thought I'd understood, but I didn't understand them quite right. And that was incredibly helpful. But in terms of, some people thought, yeah, the military must have to review this. And I believe that's true if you're in the military. But I remember the first piece I published about this experience, Andrew was a private, basically. He was brand new. And he's like, I don't know. Can you write about this? So he went to his boss, and his boss said, she's not in the Army. She can write whatever she wants. And it's not like I have privy to national security information. So it's, no, but they're probably aware of it now. So it'll be interesting to see how all that shakes out.
So what are you writing now? What's next on your agenda after the tour?
Yeah, I mean, it's too early to say what it's about, really, but I have kind of a novel percolating in my head in the background that's almost like my little safe space that I go to to think about it, or think about it when I'm nodding off going to sleep. That's a really common place I go and kind of like wander the halls of my mind. But it's definitely going to be a novel. I mean, don't quote, well, you can quote me because I'm live, but it's definitely going to be a novel. It's definitely not going to be about my life. I love memoirs. I've loved writing this book. I'm so lucky to have it out in the world, but I can't wait to write about a life that is not my own.
So I just want to thank you. Thank you. This has been a wonderful interview.
Thank you.
We are lucky to have this book out in the world. It's The Wives by Simone Gorrindo, just out this week. It's a beautiful read. I have no military family. I know that's not true. I have one cousin who served in the military ages and ages ago, but
most people have at least one person, I've learned. It's kind of amazing. Most people have at least one person, I've learned, but they don't necessarily really know anything about that world.
It's a fascinating world. It's a touching world. It will make you think about your friendship. It will make you think about how couples navigate whatever tensions they have within their marriage. It will have you think about lots of good things, and it'll have you staying up late because you just want to see what comes next. So go out, buy The Wives.
Thank you so much, Ellen.
Okay. And just before we leave, thank you, Simone. This has been lovely. If you liked what you saw here today, please feel free to share it. You can find this link on YouTube, post it to your social media. We'll be happy to see it out there. Of course, we'd love for you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram and YouTube. The more you comment and post about us, the better we will be seen in the world, and we will be able to attract more great authors like Simone. I will be back in studio on Thursday, May 9th with another great debut. This is a novel by Elizabeth O'Connor called Whale Fall, not to be confused with last year's book called Whale Fall. And Publishers Weekly said this book is luminous, and I highly agree. But before you get to that, go out, buy The Wives, and have a great weekend reading. You'll love this. Thanks so much.
Thank you.